From the Emmy-nominated Erie Veterans Series, Vietnam Common Bonds. The true stories of the men and women in our community who faithfully served our country during the Vietnam conflict. Vietnam Common Bonds. Proudly brought to you by John V. Schultz, Furniture and Mattress. And now, Vietnam Common Bonds.
$9,087,000 military personnel served on active duty during the official Vietnam era, August the 5th, 1954 to May 7th, 1975. I'm Luther R. Mannis, Jr. My rank when in Vietnam was First Sergeant. The time frame that I served in Vietnam was from November 7th of 1967 to November 11th, 1968. I served in the city of Quy Nhon, Vietnam, and my main duty was First Sergeant.
2,709,918 Americans served in uniform in Vietnam. My name is Fred Olds. I was in Vietnam 1971 to 1972. I was a lieutenant at the time and flew helicopters. Flew Hueys. We did a lot of resupply and took combat troops into LZs, flew dignitaries around, did surveillance and that sort of thing.
The first combat mission took place January 12, 1962. The last 2 American deaths happened on April 30th, 1975. My name is John Patrick Dean. I was a sergeant. The time frame was 1965-1966. I served in Long Binh, outside of Bien Hoa Air Base, about 40 miles above Saigon. I was in a transportation group. Our main duties were supply and defend the immediate area we're in.
Recorded as of this date, 58,315 American military personnel have been killed in the line of duty. My name is Mary Ann D'Alessio, retired U.S. Army Nurse Corps Major, and I served from 1967 to 1987. And I served in Vietnam in 1967 to 1968. And I was head nurse in the recovery room at the 12th Evac Hospital, Cu Chi, Vietnam.
Give me a sentence or two of how you feel about the Vietnam War. Well, Vietnam is really difficult for me because I didn't really understand we were there. Plus, as far as I remember, it was never declared a war. It was an insurgency. So we didn't have the support. If we were fired upon, we had to get permission to fire back. I always thought if they would have made it a war, and if they were dedicated, the soldiers, to defend the country, they should have been 100%. And I didn't feel that as a country we were.
I guess, Pat, I sort of agree with that, is that there was certainly a lot of dissent back home.
Right.
And so as a citizen, you had to make a choice of whether you were going to go with the draft if you were drafted, or if you were going to leave the country or do something else. And I think looking at the war itself, it was, at the time, I just saw it as I chose to, as my duty to go in at the time, and and as we get farther and farther away, you just wonder what did we accomplish by doing it.
My thoughts on the Vietnam War, it's awful hard for me to give an opinion. I want to say, I don't think we should have been there. That's my feeling, and I probably may regret saying that, but that's how I felt. And I think because of all the casualties that we took unnecessarily, I think that's
about you, Luther?
My attitude when I went to Vietnam was that I was not at war with Vietnamese people. I was at war with those little guys running around in the little black suit. Consequently, the Vietnamese people that we had working as indigent personnel inside the compound, I treated them just like I treated an American, and was very fortunate that I didn't have to do any combat for it because my unit never received an incoming enemy round the year that I was in Vietnam.
How and where did you go in for the service, basic training and deployment? I got a draft notice the day after Christmas in 1969. I think it was President Johnson's last act in office at the time. So I went to basic training. I was in infantry AIT, and the commanding officer came around and asked would I like to go to OCS. I said yes. And while I was in OCS, they said, would you like to fly a helicopter? And I said, well, yeah, who wouldn't want to do that? So I ended up going to flight school, and that was started at Fort Polk, went to Fort Sill, and then in flight school I went to Fort Walters and a number of places after that.
I went into the service March 23rd, 1946. I grandfathered in under what they call a World War II vet, but I'm not a combat World War II vet. I took my basic training at Aberdeen Proving Grounds, Maryland, which was the Ordnance Basic Training Center, and eventually wound up doing an overseas assignment in Hawaii, the Philippine Islands, Japan, and back to the United States. I didn't receive a deployment to Vietnam until November of 1967, and I completed that deployment in November the 11th, 1968.
I entered the service in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in May 5th, 1967, and didn't have basic training. We had 2 weeks officers school, and then we were deployed to Vietnam.
I entered the service, was attending Edinburgh University, and I was transferring to Gannon University. And I cut down on credits because I was running out of money and I was working, so my credits were too low, so I got drafted. Was put on a bus at 6 o'clock in the morning to go to Buffalo, and I never came home. And I wound up at basic training in New Jersey. And then luckily I was a football player, so I played for military base, but then eventually we went to Vietnam from Fort Eustis, Virginia.
Yeah, it was strange how the draft changed your life.
Yes.
I mean, you'd be in college, and it's sort of the same thing happened to me as a transfer from one place to another. You knew that the notice was not far behind that.
Yep.
What was the feeling of you and your fellow service members being there? I can simply say that in one word, mixed. Some troops felt we shouldn't be there. Some troops felt, well, it's my duty to be here. Other troops felt, I don't even know why I'm here. It was just a mixed bowl.
That was my feeling too. I can't elaborate on it enough.
The hardest thing for me was, I was drafted. I wind up in Vietnam, and a lot of my mentors were master sergeants like yourself. And I saw many retire because I saw many that did not agree because of the conditions of the insurgency. So they retired from the military.
And I agree with all of this. It was very difficult because so many people had negative views of the war at that time, and they were serving. I mean, they were there with you. And in an aviation unit, it's probably a little different than any of whatever you've been through, because we always had to depend on each other.
Right.
But it was very difficult when you'd come back and you'd see, remember those little plastic vials that the heroin came in? And you'd walk around some of the barracks and maybe you didn't see those. And you knew that folks were shooting up drugs the night before, and then you'd go out and fly the next day. And I think some of that was because there wasn't the sense that, if you watch a World War II movie,
Right.
where everybody was behind this and there was a clear purpose. And I think because there wasn't,
Yeah.
And because there was such negative political and news back home, it was very difficult to.
What was the hardest or scariest experience in your tour of duties? I think one time we were up close to Laos in Cambodia, and we were doing a convoy. We were attacked, and the cloud cover kept the helicopters coming in, providing air support, and we were there about a day and a half. And we were fighting people that were on drugs. They were farmers. They were having, sticks in their hands, attacking machine guns and army.
Really?
And the Viet Cong were behind them. So we really thought we were not coming out of it. At that time, we didn't think we were coming out of that action, but we did, because the weather cleared, the Hueys, Cobras came in and beat off the Viet Cong, because they couldn't run faster than the radios and the air attacks.
And one day we had 75 casualties. That we had no place to put them. All we could do was triage them outside the huts. And we worked as fast as we could, get them where we had to get them. It was a horrible day. And not only GIs did we have to triage, we had to triage the Vietnamese, fathers, mothers, grandfathers. They brought everybody in there. It was a horrible day.
I get some of the stuff that I found scariest was going into LZs. In a helicopter, you don't know really whether you're being shot at, unless they're tracers. Now at night you can see the tracers coming, but during the day you didn't always know. But when they were firing RPGs or rockets or throwing grenades, you could see that. And you see that, you're going in and you're seeing all that happen, and you still got to go into that landing zone and drop those guys off, and that's pretty scary. And sometimes it's just almost self-inflicted. Going into an LZ, you don't know the wind, and the wind changes, and you're going into a mountaintop, and all of a sudden you lose lift, and you're just screaming down the side of the mountain. You don't know whether you're going to be able to pull up and get out of there in time.
That was when we had to fly medevac. Even though we were nurses in the recovery room, we still had to fly medevac to get the soldiers where they had to go to a different hospital, because all we could do was triage them and keep them there for so long. Then we had to get them to the hospital so they could get the care. One night I was flying medevac, and we got hit. We had to land. We couldn't finish our mission until after that firefight was over with. And that poor soldier, it's a wonder he made it through.
Yeah.
But
And it's scary. You're just sitting there, and all of a sudden something goes wrong, and you don't know exactly what it is. And usually you didn't even know you were hit until you go out and you look, and there's holes in the side of something.
Exactly right.
So when I think of scary, I think of the things that you did, or being in firefights on the ground. Because when I got there, we thought the war was over, and then my first mission, we're flying out in the middle of nowhere with these guys in the jungle. And I thought the Vietnamese were in charge of this now. And there were these soldiers out there who had been through a firefight, and we were just taking in some resupply to them. And
I think, too, some of the scariest moments, if it wasn't for the nurses and the Hueys removing people, the first line of support was the actual soldiers, where we would have to take a poncho and take our knife and cut out the poncho to put it over a chest wound to stop the air from the sucking, to hold it until we got to support. I think that was scary. You just did it. You had to, but it was scary because you didn't know whether the individual you did that to survived, whether they lived. They went off on a Huey someplace, so you never knew whether they survived.
and then you took care of them.
Yep.
That's right.
Yeah.
I think that was a scary moment for me as well.
If we were flying in, one of my earliest missions was flying in a resupply to a company that was under fire. And the pilot I was with had been in Laos, and so he had been shot down 2 or 3 times and didn't want to go. When we're going in, and we can see that you were talking about the napalm, the jets bringing in the napalm and the fire, and listening to the terror of the guys on the radio. It's just,
Yeah.
You could be a long way from napalm and you feel the heat.
Oh, sure.
Oh, yeah.
We did. Yes.
So it was just that you could hear the terror in the voices on the radio, the guys on the ground.
Well, I think my scariest moment was Tet 68 because the operation started and I was out in the compound somewhere and somebody ran and got me and said, got to come to the orderly room. I go down and they said something about there's an all-out offensive and all hell broke out. My unit did not receive an incoming round that night, but that same day, overhead, the helicopter was sitting overhead firing at the Viet Cong, which was going up the side of the mountain towards the signal unit up on top of that mountain. We also had people from my unit and other units that were up on top of another mountain as security to keep the Viet Cong from overtaking that position and being able to lob fireworks out on the ships that were anchored out in the China Sea. But the big problem was we had a graveyard that was east of us, and as he pointed out, we had these political instructions never to fire in that graveyard under any circumstance. So here we are with an all-out offensive taking place. My only thought was, of course, their intelligence knows that that graveyard's there. They also know that we're not supposed to fire through there, so consequently that's where they're coming from.
Right.
So as I was going out and checking the defenses and what have you, I made the decision that I wanted flares to light up that graveyard so we would be able to see them coming. Unfortunately, when I was doing some of my officers' training, there were certain parts of the training that didn't seem to be very important, and learning how to call in flares was part of it. And here I was with a need to have those flares, and I couldn't give the proper instructions to the unit up on top of the mountain that was going to send the flares. They did shoot the flares up for me, and guess what? Instead of being over the graveyard, they were hanging right over the top of us, sitting up there dancing around like nobody's business, and I'm going like this.
Oh my God.
Fortunately, they did not come to that graveyard, and I said we didn't get an incoming round. So that was a scary moment because there was a need for that light up for the safety of all the men there, and I didn't respond in that manner, so that was scary.
Was there one or more people that you met at wartime and had a connection with? Yes, there was one gentleman. He was my physician in charge of the recovery room and OR, and he got us through many times when there was nothing more we could do for the soldiers before we could get them out, and they died, and he was right there. He never left the post unless he had to go back to surgery. And then I served with him again in Fort Dix, and I just had a letter about a year ago that he died with Alzheimer's. And I said that was a terrible way for him to end up, because he was such a wonderful person.
I think a fond memory on my part was there's two. A gentleman named David Pearson, who's from Liverpool, England. He wanted to get U.S. citizenship, so he enlisted in the U.S. Army. When he goes to Vietnam, he was a chaplain's driver. They didn't give him a weapon, but he was a chaplain's driver. There were a lot of Australians I was stationed with, and South Koreans. The South Koreans, I don't know how we ever lost the war with North Korea, because the South Koreans were tough. The ROK troops are tough fighters.
Yeah, I think one of the things that strikes me is that as close as we were in the military, and I don't think you can explain to a civilian how tight-knit you become and how you depend on people, is the fogginess of my memory of a lot of these. I remember, my real close friend was, I don't remember his last name, but he was Captain. We just called him Captain Stan. And you lose track of them over time. And yet I can still see the face. I can remember flying with them. My crew chief from Alabama is just a typical, wonderful Southern guy, had a great personality. But after I came back, there was no way to get in touch with him again to find out where he is.
Well, I'm very fortunate. I know where my executive officer is, he's in Boston, Massachusetts. My company commander is in Coppercall or Coppernell, something like that, Coppell, Texas. One of my company clerks is in Omaha, Nebraska. And an E9 that was in intelligence and operation is in Minnesota. So I'm in touch with all four of those guys. I went down to personally to see my company commander, last year. So from Vietnam, I'm still in touch with 4 people, and that knit
Wow.
that you say that you mentioned is they're just like this.
Boy, I kind of miss that.
I do.
So I've kept in no contact. I was in a few weddings, and the last one was a guy named Cecilio Rodriguez in Corpus Christi, Texas. Married a young lady in Ohio, and I was his best man. And we've not kept in contact.
Wow.
It's hard because everybody served other places, and after 30 years, it's really hard to remember a lot of them.
Yes.
And
it's
I
hard.
did a dumb thing. When I came home from Vietnam and I got my house and everything settled, I burnt all my souvenirs of Vietnam.
Really?
I didn't want anything else to do with it.
Yeah.
And now I regret that I did it.
Yeah.
Well, I usually send something like 300 Christmas cards, Mother's Day cards, Father's Day cards, Easter cards, with people that I've been associated with. The one officer just died at 93. He was the first black officer that I met when I first came in the United States Army in 1946. We were friends for 60-some years, and he just died recently. So that out of that 300 and some cards, I'd say over 150 of them are military personnel from all the 24 years that I was in the service.
Wow. You should probably get another ribbon for that.
Yeah.
That's impressive. Was there an enlightened moment you had about the war you were in? I think for me, the enlightenment came later. We were talking earlier about how we were just kids when we went in. And it was like maybe we didn't understand what it was all about. But as time went on, it just became clear to me that this was sort of a meaningless event. And maybe there was something that came out of it. But for me, it was like we went over there and we flew all those missions. All these people were killed, and we ended up flying everybody back, and the Vietnamese people were in boats, trying to get away from the North Vietnamese. And so I'm not sure what we accomplished, but I don't regret going. I think it was a very valuable experience for me, but I'm not sure geopolitically or as a nation what we got from it. And I think one of the things that struck me about this as I look back on it is that when politicians run a war, you're talking about you couldn't shoot into this. If soldiers run a war, the war possibly could have ended.
Exactly right.
It bothers me that we set up all these rules so that you can't be soldiers. And if you want to use soldiers, let soldiers do it.
I think that was a feeling of everybody. And Vietnam was one of those political wars.
Yeah.
It wasn't run the way it should have been.
I think an enlightening moment for me is on the way over to Vietnam, we left San Diego on ship.
Really?
On merchant ships. So it was a slow ride over, so it was almost like a vacation. And there was a good friend of mine that I went to Harvard Creek High School with. He was in the Marines. So the ship first docked, and we had to wait for the daylight because of the small arms fire going into Da Nang. And then I went down to Saigon area, Vung Tau, and got off, and I find out 9 days later, my friend, who had a 30-day or 18, however long it was, almost like a cruise, his first battle action, he was killed.
Oh, that's
So, 9 days, and all of a sudden I think the reality hit me that, that there's a chance that, you may not come back.
Exactly right.
But then all of a sudden it's reality, because you're young,
Yeah.
your early 20s, late teens, and all of a sudden reality, this is serious.
when I went to Vietnam, I was not a young bunny hopper. I was in my late 30s. So the thing that I found throughout all my military travels, and I'm glad that I made all those travels, because the contact that I had with people, both from the enemy standpoint and from the non-combatants, is that we're all human beings. We all bleed the same way, and we all die the same way.
Right.
And it's just hard to take and pull a young man out and stick him in there and tell him to kill somebody, which is against basically his morals and all the things that he's been taught. And then all of a sudden, he's thrust into this situation, and then we wonder why they fall apart. It's disheartening.
I don't
to
know
see
if
this.
any of you knew about McNamara's 10,000. It was 10,000 GIs that their mentality was not what you would call war, but they were sent there, and they were fighting with the GIs, and the GIs used to tell us it was just horrible. The way they acted, they couldn't take instructions, and they'd shoot at anybody. And that's the 10,000, that was McNamara's 10,000.
The other thing that struck me about Vietnam is you take off, or you get on a boat and you fly to Vietnam, and as you do that, you go across the time date line, and it's a different day. And when you get to Vietnam, it's really a different day. And when you're in a war zone, you're in a different world. So it's kind of like going through the looking glass or something. And I don't think, something was, I guess, eye-opening for my wife was, we went to see Apocalypse Now. And I mean, it's kind of a bizarre movie, but she said, it gives me a sense of what it was like to go from civilization to war.
Correct.
And so, and then you get on an airplane, you're talking about, you push them into war, then you put them on an airplane, you bring them back, and now you're in society again. And I think it's...
That's a good point, because, when we were younger, we watched movies, cowboys, war movies,
Yeah.
and you never saw the bloodshed. The more movies today, like Apocalypse Now,
Yeah.
show you the real thing.
Right.
Saving Private Ryan shows you the real
Oh,
thing.
man, yeah.
You heard the bullets. You heard the bullets going over your head. You heard the shrapnel. You heard the mortars when they landed. The movies today, I think maybe that's why some of the younger people today, they're playing video games. It's not the reality of which really, if you pull that trigger on a gun, what's the end result? The damage, the holes,
And you wonder if that's
which
what...
you saw on a daily basis.
Yeah.
We didn't. You saw it frequently, but not,
Oh, yeah.
you saw it daily.
Every day.
Vietnam, Common Bonds will return in a moment. We now return to Vietnam, Common Bonds.
Was there a fond moment or story that keeps in your heart? Yeah, I guess there's a couple of them about Vietnam. One of them was, believe it or not, there was an orphanage outside of Queen Yon that, believe it or not, that our soldiers supported that
We
orphanage.
did too.
And the Viet Cong came down one night and attacked that orphanage and just murdered up those little kids. And I had a friend here who liked to keep cards. And I was in corresponding back with her, and I sent her one of those cards that was the blood of the kid. One of the kids in that orphanage, blood was on that card when I sent it there. So that orphanage was a fond part, a fondness of it. And of course you have these little kids that's working at your compound as indigenous personnel that you get attached to, and it's just like having a kid of your own. And
Yeah.
if something happens to him, it's just like it happens to your own kid. Because after I left Vietnam, I found out that this little kid had gone off with a guy who was one of our supply people who had a Vietnamese girlfriend. He would leave Queen Yon and go to some little city and took this little kid with him, and the kid got killed. So that kind of struck me when I found out that this little kid got killed.
My fond memory is in Benoit, there was a probably 5-year-old young lady named Mai Lee, and her mother worked at our base, which was cleaning a tent basically. And her father, because her mother, his wife, was working for the U.S. Army, was tortured and killed. So naturally, we were all young teenagers, we adopted her. So if we got cookies, candy from home, we would go to the village. But just before I left, the village was they honored us by making us blood brothers to the village. So they put a little silver band on our arms. It was made out of some hard material. And that meant whenever you traveled to a Montagnard village or a village in Vietnam, you were supposed to be treated as a guest. So Mai Lee, I have no idea where she's at, what she happened, but she was an important part of our life. I think it took us away from the reality of the war, that here's a young little girl, almost like a little baby sister, that through no fault of her own, she was thrown into this war environment. So that was a very fond moment for me.
My fond memory was I escorted the troops to Bob Hope's show on our compound. And just to get them out of the hospital, you can't imagine the difference, how they felt and forgot about what was going on in the war. It was really interesting.
I guess for me, it was some of the friendships that I had going at the time, but my wife baked chocolate chip cookies. And every week I would get a box of chocolate chip cookies to share with folks. And there was one time I got a call. Somebody had, I don't know, packed something on top, but it was just crumbs. But every week she would send me chocolate chip cookies and letters. And it was...
That could have been on her mailing list.
But it was just nice to have that tie to home. And because I think people, it's like Iran and Afghanistan now. The people back here have no ties or perception of what's going on. And to know that there was somebody back here that was watching out for me.
Was your mission or duty clear to you? My mission was, I knew I was going to Vietnam to be a nurse in a surgical unit. So mine was cut and dried.
Mine too. Once you're with the military in the service, your MOS, which is your job title, was very concise and clear what your duties were. And your sergeant, your first sergeant, made it clear to you what your function was. So there was no question about what my duties were.
And I'm the same way. There was no question. Now, if the question is an overarching, were we there to save Vietnam or whatever, I'm not sure that was quite so clear. But my duty...
The political aspect.
Yeah,
was,
the political is...
Well, as a military person, I knew what my mission was, and I knew what my duty was because my MOS and my rank told me what it was. And however, when I went to Vietnam, I went as a ordnance maintenance personnel, only to find out at the personnel center when I arrived that that position was not open, that I would have to do something else. At that particular time, I carried an ordnance MOS and I also carried a truckmaster MOS. And they were reassigning me in my truckmaster MOS. And I had an apprehension about taking that assignment because I had a problem that is, and he can tell you that if a person is in a convoy and in charge of that convoy and they got a hearing problem, and they get that radio function up there telling them that what the condition is, and he's saying, say again, what? I didn't understand that. The convoy is still moving, and everybody's life is dependent upon me, and that's what I was going to be, a truck master. So fortunately for me, I happened to look out and see Headquarters 593rd General Support Group, and I walked out of personnel and walked over and reported to the Sergeant Major. He told me the same thing, that position is not open, that guy's coming back. He said, but I have 2 first sergeants, they're both drunks. You want to be the first sergeant? I told him I'll take the position. So I became the first sergeant. But I want to tell you why those 2 guys were drunks and what respect I had for those 2 drunks. those two drunks were infantry first sergeants who were ground sloggers out there walking through that mud and grass, who today goes out there with 200 and 300 men and come back with 35 and 40 and stuff like that. That kind of stuff will make you a drunk. Sure. So they had my highest respect, and I told them, for the time that you remain here, you have no problem with me. Sleep, lay back, do whatever the hell you want to do. As a matter of fact, you have my bed, because I was fortunate enough to have a bed, chest of drawers, foot locker, wall locker, refrigerator, pork chops, steaks, all that kind of stuff, whiskey locker, cigars. I had everything because I was the first shirt and the troops were taking care of me. So all of those things, when those infantry sergeants came down from Da Nang and from way and wherever north of it for their resupply runs and stuff like that, you think my house or you house? Well, my bed was their bed.
If you recall, I think the non-commissioned officers, the E6, E7, E8 sergeants really ran the Army, but their drink of choice was old granddad. Did you know you would be coming home from this war? Was it a day-to-day? I think back then you were so young that you're invincible. Yeah. You didn't realize it was going to happen to somebody else. It wasn't going to happen to you. So I was confident I was coming home. One or two times in certain battle actions or in situations, yes, you get concerned, but you're so busy in that moment doing what you're trained to do, your MOS, your job title, it was automatic.
Right.
So you didn't have time to think, was I going to be
Exactly.
zapped or finished off and not returning home?
Exactly. That's
Yeah.
my feeling.
Yeah, I'd agree. It was, and I was there. It was relatively quiet, and we would fly things, and I knew stuff was happening, but it never occurred to me that I would die.
I didn't dwell on dying either. But I do have two occasions where I felt kind of uneasy because I had a young man who was involved in the drugs. He had marijuana in his clothing, marijuana in his wall locker, foot locker, and you name it. And a warrant officer and I made a search of it, and as a result, we proceeded to start an Article 15 on him because of it, only to have the military tell us it was an illegal search and seizure. And I asked the question, if I belong to the service, my clothes belong to the service, all my equipment from the service, I'm over here in Vietnam, this is American soil because Vietnam, we're in charge of it. How can that be an illegal search and seizure? They told me it was illegal search and seizure and turn him loose, and he's still there in my unit. So, as I say, I had a room in the bed, and one night I'm laying in the bed, and you know how you get that super sick feeling that there's something here besides me, and you look up in the dark and you're trying to figure it out, and finally I figured out who he was with the impulse to come up and try to punch him out. But then I said, well, from the laying position to the upright position is a long way. Better you do something else. And so I pulled a bluff on him and asked him what the hell he was doing in there. And he stuttered and said, well, First Sergeant, I could have been a VC. And I said, so what the hell does that mean? I said, get the hell out of here. So he left. But
What
he did
surprises
that to
me is that I was there earlier, 65. Now, we'd be going through poppy fields. The Vietnamese are attached with, when they took their break, they had these little bamboo pipes. They would smoke marijuana. But early in my career in Vietnam, if you were caught with anything, Article 15, which is more than a slap on the wrist, you were going to jail. You didn't want to go to a military jail. So I think most of the guys were afraid. Later on in the 70s, I find out there was drug use was so rampant, it surprises me because in our era, it was, you better not. Now, I don't know if it was our era in time or it was the 48 group I was with, our colonel. It was 6,000, but we did not have a drug issue that I was aware of or the officers were.
What were your views going in and coming out of the war? Going into the war, at least I had anxiety because I had no idea what it looked like, what we would be doing, where would you be staying, and so that almost blanked out, I guess, concerns about dying, you know, or some of the other issues geopolitically. Coming out of there, I think what, you know, for me it was you realize how young and naive and inexperienced
That's
we
exactly
all were,
right.
and the fragility of life and the importance of life, and how important people are. I think you talked about that earlier. But my view of the war, coming back was pretty much the same. You could choose what you're going to do. You have to choose what it is you
Yep.
do.
Exactly.
I think too, there was no anxiety going over because you didn't know it was on the other end.
There you go.
Once you got there, your opinion changed. You saw the suffering, you saw the killing, you saw
Right.
the innocents, people that, you know, they were innocent Montagnard villagers that all they cared about was living in their own little world, and they're being pulled all these different directions. And you saw the brutality of what the human species does to each other. So it changes your mind quickly when you actually see it. Going over, it's just like, it's a dream. You know, I'm going to
Yeah.
Vietnam. It's just like I'm going to go to Florida. I'm going to go to North
Yeah.
Carolina. Well, I'm going to Vietnam. Okay, go. All of a sudden you're there, and reality slaps you in the face saying this is real.
Yeah.
So your opinion changes, and I think you grow up fast and you start to look at the reality of Vietnam, the reality of life, and you got to enjoy it.
That's right.
One of the things that I found is that the problems that we have here in the United States with this here racial thing that's going on right now, it's strange when you get into Vietnam. You don't even begin to see that, because I go down to the helicopter port and I would watch the wounded be coming back in from all these different battle zones into the Quinyon airfield to that evac hospital that she's talking about, and see those teams of nurses and doctors, and those nurses and doctors were Chinese, Japanese, French, Italian, Americans, you name it. And I never saw a black soldier sit there and see a white nurse getting ready to stick that transfusion in his arm, say, get the hell away from me, I don't want you near me, and I don't want that white blood in me. I want black blood and I want a black nurse. Like hell, he's grabbing onto every daggone thing like this here for his dear life. I don't care who in the hell is there. And I said to myself, how is it you can do this here, but you get back to the States, you got all this here crazy stuff? Because I'm sitting there and looking at the television set of the stuff that was going on in New York and Chicago, and there's a letter I wrote to my daughter about that same damn thing, and I'm sitting in the daggone combat zone telling her, don't let this daggone kind of crap start going through your head, because it's not what you see.
You and I were in the same unit, the First Army, and you were a brother to me. There was no, I had to rely on you, you had to rely on me, so we became friends.
And I think
We didn't see that going on in the States. It was uncommon. There was Afro-American officers. You gave them the respect of giving them the salute. Sergeants, I had a lot of respect for the master sergeants that basically ran the Army. They were teachers, guidance counselors, everything. And that's what you respected. It didn't matter whether you were Afro-American, you were Chinese, whatever. You respected the position that person attained.
Well, and you had to rely on everybody. And I think
Right.
that's one of the things people who have never been in the service don't understand. And I'm not saying that it's universally, but it seemed to me that there wasn't a lot of racial difficulty.
We didn't see it.
It was like you relied on everybody, and you were a soldier. Now, I'm not saying that it was universal, but the one place I thought where the chance for advancement or whatever seemed to be pretty much equal. Now, I don't know what you saw, but
There was, even after Truman signed the desegregation of the service, people have to be smart enough to understand you can't legislate racial
right.
issues. It's a personal human trait. This is why I like the draft, because the draft saved my butt, because it got me out of my trapped triangle of Pennsylvania, New York and Ohio, Buffalo, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland. After I got out beyond that and began to see the world, my tones and my whole life began to change, my compassion, my understanding. And the more you stay in the military, the longer you stay in there and you start seeing these kind of things, your compassion and stuff changes to the point where, like all of us are saying, we were in Vietnam, but these little kids, these little girls, we didn't see them as Viet Congs and what
Right.
have you, although some of them were Viet Congs, because some of those same
Never
little
know.
kids turned on and hurt some of the people that were helping them out. But you can't blame that kid for that.
There was a good friend of mine, Lionel, and we're going into an action at night, and there was a moon, so we were using a little lampblack on her face. And all of a sudden, he starts laughing like crazy because he was an Afro-American. He goes, I don't need that stuff. But then you start talking, he would also tell me that, you know, he doesn't need the lampblack on his face to keep his, because he's already got it. But he'd also tell me, he goes, but I go out in the sun, I better put some sunscreen on because I still burn. That was interesting. You start learning, you get really down to different people and you learn their aspirations and you learn the history behind them. So you're getting more into people, I guess.
But I'm with you on the draft. It's without the draft, you've got a group of people who are separated. We're paying people to fight our wars now, and everybody should have a piece of the burlap. Should have some sort of service obligation in the country, and have some sense that I'm an American, ergo I have some responsibility.
How were you treated when you returned from the war? I want to tell you, I had nothing happen. All of these stories that I hear about them being spit on, called
It's
this and
true.
called that, didn't happen to me. I landed in McCord Air Force Base out there in Seattle, Washington. Got on went into air terminals and picked up plane tickets, jumped on a plane, flew to Washington, D.C., got off of Washington, D.C., got on the bus. Nobody spit at me. And even today, I have had nobody come up to me and said, you baby killer, you one of them Vietnam guys.
Well, you're fortunate.
Nobody. It just didn't happen to me.
You're
I don't know.
fortunate.
I didn't have that, but trying to fly home, I was in an airport flying military standby, and nobody gave up their seat. A woman told me, looked at me, and she says, I've been waiting 2 hours to get home. I've been waiting 19 months. Finally, I got onto a plane because it wasn't full. The thing that bothered me when I came home is back in that era. Today, all of our politicians, they wear American flag and a little lapel, and they really brag about the military, how supportive they are of the military. I don't remember any politician that had a U.S. flag and a lapel or backed the soldiers coming home.
Mary, you had a different experience coming
Yes,
home.
I did. I was home on leave, and I was walking down the street going to my bank, and this woman came up and spit on me and called me a baby killer. So I know that it did happen.
Oh, I know it happened.
I wanted to strangle that woman, but I said no. The guy grabbed her and said, what do you want to do? I said, just let her go. She don't have any more common sense than the man on the moon. I wasn't going to jeopardize the rest of my career by doing something stupid. But I was spit on.
That's what I felt our politicians in that era did. If they would have been more forthright and supportive, maybe that wouldn't happen. But you didn't have the
Right,
support
you're
from the other
exactly
side.
right.
But it's kind of interesting. At that time, we were viewed negatively, and the folks who went off to Sweden or Canada or whatever were minor heroes or
Right.
And now it is completely reversed. It
Right.
seems to me as
It's,
we get some recognition.
Did any of you others have any?
It was just, I wasn't spit upon or anything like that, but just there was no recognition, there was
Yeah.
no welcome homes.
Right.
That's what I learned some years later. I worked at Erie Insurance, and they did a program on Vietnam veterans and the wall. And the thing I learned from the Veterans Outreach Organization was to
reach out and shake hands.
welcome home.
Thank
Welcome
you.
home. Welcome home,
Yep,
which we didn't get.
that's right, exactly. It's so
tough.
hard
It's
to
tough. I've talked more about Vietnam because
This
we
the
didn't
first
talk about
time-
it.
that's right.
It was
This-
because we're young. There was moments that you didn't want to talk about.
Right, exactly.
And so it's maybe with age.
And especially with people that have been in the,
Right.
in the service and in Vietnam, I think it made a big difference.
I noticed that too when when they were still alive. Some of my family that were in World War II or Korea, they would never talk about it. But I saved some of my paraphernalia. I tucked away someplace just in case that someday grandkids. It's physical because I think after a while when life goes on, you go back and was I really there? Did this really happen? Was it a dream? Was it real? And you find out by having that physical remembrances, you realize it was real.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It really
I
did happen.
think the thing that I learned about
For the
those-
sake of the 58,000 guys that didn't come home.
Right.
I found that those veterans who don't talk about the war, they have a real reason not to talk about the war because they can't actually sit down at their family table and tell them the stuff that they really saw, and sometimes it's what they had to do that they can't sit down and talk to them about because nobody sitting at that table is going to understand.
I think what hurt Vietnam veterans too is that many came home and they would still wear their army jackets, bandanas on their head, and they were still living the war. I think in life you have to, this event happened to me, it's time to move on. So, many veterans, many veterans decided to go on to college, be productive citizens in their towns, and they did a lot of good. All four of us here included. We didn't. You can't drown on what happened.
No.
It's over with.
Right.
And I think some people that did, they would not let that go. They're the ones that had the issues, the problems, that they couldn't let that go. And I think you have to. You have to go on and live your life and go on.
When you talk about talking about the war, I think there could be a book that is, what I didn't tell my wife. Because unless you're there, you can't understand what was going on.
Right.
And you can't explain what it is to be in a different place, in a completely different situation than civilization, where you can get killed. And so it's like we can sit and talk to each other because we understand that, but it's very difficult to talk about the kinds of situations you can be in with somebody who's not there.
Again, when I was in Nam, I was there early. So I think there was only, I don't remember exact statistics, but there's only like 30-some thousand U.S. soldiers when I got there. When I left, it was 530,000. So we were moved all over. So I was with the Marines, I was with the Vietnamese, I was with the South Koreans, I was with the Australians. So you saw a lot, and all of a sudden you realize that we live in a very complex world, and there's different societies. So you can't condone this person over here because they think this, because that's the only thing they've ever been exposed to. For example, there was a minister that, in his duty, his assignment was to convert people to Christianity, and he was trying to convert this small tribe in the mountains. Well, they were never out of that valley, so how can they go to hell? Because the only thing they ever saw was that world. And as long as they honored that world, they're going to get their just reward. So I think I've realized a lot of growth in that aspect, that people are different. People are a society. We can't change, the United States cannot change the world.
That's right.
And we shouldn't even be trying.
And in some aspects, this is their life, that's okay. It's sad to try to analyze the justification.
It
To
really
sum
is.
it up, war is hell.
Yep.
That's it. War is hell.
The end.